So active caring is this idea that we want to actively care for every single person on our job sites. Everybody that works for us, everybody who works for our trade partners, anyone who comes on our jobs, right? Our design partners, our owners, anyone involved in the building process. And it's really a very simple concept, right? It's thinking about them as people. So take a moment and say hi, ask how their day's going. Think about what they need to be able to do their job the best they can.
Welcome to The Power of Construction, recording live at Groundbreak. We're sitting down this week with leaders who are evolving their businesses today to forge a better industry tomorrow. I'm Sasha Reed.
And I'm Chris Langiza.
And today we have the pleasure of sitting down with a guest who's joining us. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. Jennifer Downey is the Director of Environmental Social Governance at Turner Construction. And as many of you know, Turner is the largest building contractor in the United States. She's got a ton of experience around construction, but she leads their ESG commitments to sustain our planet and protect and care for people to transform our industry with purpose. She's really good at explaining not just the what is ESG, but she's adept at explaining how this applies to the business and why it even matters. So we're really excited to bring her story to you today. Hopefully the questions that are in your mind leading up to what is ESG, we'll answer that right up front. But with that, Jennifer, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
We wanted, I kind of alluded to that in the intro, but we really kind of want to start the conversation with some definitions. I'm sure people have heard the term ESG before, but I think it's really important to kind of set some context. So could you define ESG in relationship to how Turner's defining it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we all needed more acronyms in our lives, didn't we?
Especially in construction.
There was a big dearth of acronyms.
Yeah.
So ESG stands for Environmental Social Governance. And if you think about sort of those three pillars, your environmental pillar is thinking about your impact on the planet. So thinking about the energy you use, the water, the waste we produce, our impact on biodiversity, how we influence greenhouse gas emissions, things like that. Then we move on to the S, which is social. And social is thinking about people, the impact on people. So for Turner, it's important for us that we're thinking about our impact on our employees, on our business partners, as well as our communities. And then governance is sort of the thing that people don't talk about as much. It's like the uncool part of ESG. But it's so important. It's sort of the processes and standards that are used to provide consistency and ensure that, you know, the rigor is there behind the calculations and reporting and the measurements that are happening to measure those impacts to people and the planet.
Yeah, and I will say, coming from construction, Chris and I have spent enough time talking about standards during our career on committees and volunteering with organizations that are defining standards. But there is something to be said around having a governance that allows you to set the standard process for something in order to then really measure, is this process working? Are we progressing? Are we having some type of impact? So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how ESG fits in with the overall business strategy for Turner.
So ESG is really an extension of our culture. There are so many components of our culture that we're bringing together that have existed for a long time, sort of the fabric of who we are as an organization. And so it was a really natural extension for us to take, add this layer of structure to our commitments and accountability and transparency, really building on something we've already had as a, core of who we are. And it's extremely important to our business and to our leadership team. Our leadership teams are directly involved with accountability that goes all the way up to our executive leadership team.
And I think from our conversations, it's not just that the company is behind it, but you have a passion for this as well. I'd love to understand, as a guy who ended up kind of being an early BIM guy before people knew what BIM was, another fun 3-letter acronym that we get to throw out there. I'd love to understand, what was the passion that drove you to want to be an ESG person at Turner?
That's official title, ESG person.
ESG
I love
person.
it.
Person. Yeah.
I'll take it. Yeah, so I have sort of an unusual career path. I actually began my career in architecture. I worked in practice for a number of years in Virginia and in New York before I came to Turner. And I started my career at Turner in BIM. At the time, it was very early in sort of the adoption of BIM in construction. And I was really excited about the potential for leveraging those new technologies on, all the way across the construction lifecycle. From there, I grew into a role in innovation, just sort of a logical extension in a lot of cases. It's hey, you get computers. Let me ask you this question about innovation. But now I think, ESG is really fundamentally what we've talked about at Turner for a long time. And it's this idea of purposeful innovation. So you can innovate anything, right? But should you innovate it? And when we think about the purpose behind ESG, right, trying to really be critical about our impact on people and the planet, innovation is going to be at the heart of how we achieve those bigger long-term commitments. So sort of the arc kind of follows along in terms of, those from step to step to step. And I do have a background in sort of the environmental sustainability from my architectural past as well.
So I love this idea of purposeful innovation. And it seems like that's a great way that Turner has really been able to apply this to the corporate strategy and get that executive commitment. Can you kind of walk us through what that looked like and how you started to bring it into the strategy, and what was the journey and the process like to really get executive buy-in and commitment?
Yeah, so when we set about developing our strategy, we began with what's called a materiality assessment. So that is a look across a variety of stakeholders, both internal and external, and trying to prioritize, areas of focus. Because one of the challenges with ESG is it covers so many different topics. And so you have to prioritize, right? You can't do everything all at once. So a materiality assessment helps you establish what those parameters are and how to evaluate your commitments. And then we met with cross-functional teams in each of our different areas of impact and worked really closely with those teams to understand what we were already doing, goals we were setting, where we wanted to go, and then how those formulated into our overall commitments. And each of those items are tied very closely with the work that our executive management team does. And so as we look at that, accountability through the company, it really does start with the top, goes all the way through our organization, down to our project teams that are really, doing the hard work to help us achieve those commitments.
Was there any pushback along the way? Did people kind of push back on whether or not this was the right direction?
I think it was one of those things where what we were doing really was an extension of what we were already doing at Turner. And so it just felt like the logical next step for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really important note, because it sounds like it was very much grounded in the culture you already had. And I think a lot of times people think about ESG, sometimes they think, oh, well, here's another thing I need to go do. And I love the approach that you all seem to have taken, which is no, we're just adding on a bit more governance. We're adding in some more tracking, but it's very much tied to what we do at Turner today.
Yeah, and we're very conscious of, the impact of our employees, right? Our employees are part of our commitments. And so we want to also think about, if we're asking them to do something, what that really looks like. There's a phrase we use a lot about peas on a plate. And if you have too many peas on your plate, well, I guess, if it's little kids, no one's going to eat all those peas. But
some adults
by
do.
the way, I don't eat any of them. Sasha knows that I hate peas. And so if you put them on my plate alone, I'm
yeah, so
ruins the whole deal.
no peas on your plate.
No peas on my plate.
Well, maybe we'll give you a different vegetable. So part of what we're trying to do is really leverage existing data sources. Think about processes we already have. Where can we leverage information that we're already collecting, or information that we can automate the collection of, to be able to capture the information we need to be able to analyze it and make decisions and things like that without necessarily, adding a task.
And one of the things that I know you shared with us is that you've actually launched your first published ESG report, which congratulations. that is, for anyone who's done that in the past, like that is not an easy task. But I'm curious, launching your first published ESG report, was there something around the timing of launching it? Was it just you're at that level of maturity, or was there something else in the timing of kind of doubling down on this initiative now to make it publicly discoverable?
Yeah, it was really important to us to have a public ESG report. I think one of the concepts in ESG that's, maybe a little bit new for some companies is the idea of this transparency and accountability. And when we launched our strategy, we published our commitments on the website so that those are available for anyone to take a look at. And then you want to be able to publicly track and report on your progress, because I think it's really easy to have commitments that you know about, but nobody else knows about, right? It's like New Year's resolutions, right? Like, I'm going to have a secret New Year's resolution. And then when I don't keep it, like...
I was going to say, it's like being on a diet, but not telling anybody you're on a diet. And they're all like, why isn't he eating the peas? I don't understand why he's not eating the peas.
So same idea, right? Is having that transparency and accountability is really important. And I think, there's this really interesting idea that the most important thing is, you want to show forward progress, but we also know that, there are real world constraints that are happening. And so sometimes things don't go quite as, exactly as you planned. And being open and transparent about, challenges or hurdles that come along and how you'll tackle those is actually important, because part of the goal is that we want to collectively learn from what everybody else is doing so that we can advance as an industry, right? These are not closely held secrets that we want to keep for ourselves. We want to see this move across the industry as a whole. It's a lot like safety. And, safety is an important part of our ESG strategy. But I think if you use that as an example, right, there are safety groups that get together and they talk about when they've had recordable incidents and how they learn from them. Because what we want to do is advance, as a whole and learn from each other, not keep that information to ourselves.
What it sounds like to me is like it becomes a lot more real, first of all, when you put it out there publicly, but also a lot more collaborative, right? Because now others know that you're working on this, how it is that you're approaching it, and can lead to those conversations that might bring, best in class, best practices together, new ways of solving challenges and problems together, which I think our industry needs more of in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are so many different categories that we're working to tackle. Last week was the Green Build conference. And so there were a lot of really exciting conversations that happened there with groups that are talking about, greenhouse gas emissions reductions and strategies to do that. We're also part of an organization called Design for Freedom that's focused on eliminating modern slavery in the building material supply chain. And so same idea, right? That you're bringing together organizations with like focuses and really trying to collaborate and learn together.
And I think one of the things that Turner has actually been very forthcoming with and leading the industry when we think about culture is your active caring. That is something that is spoken about openly. And I remember a few years ago, we were really leaning into support and help the women in construction community. And Turner kept coming up because of the commitments that your CEO had made. And that this wasn't just a poster on the wall within a trailer. This was being lived out through how Turner showed up in industry. And it had a really, I'll call it a positive ripple effect into the field. I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about that active caring component of the culture and how that's integrated into ESG and beyond.
So active caring is this idea that we want to actively care for every single person on our job sites. Everybody that works for us, everybody who works for our trade partners, anyone who comes on our jobs, right? Our design partners, our owners, anyone involved in the building process. And it's really a very simple concept, right? It's thinking about them as people. So take a moment and say hi, ask how their day's going. Think about what they need to be able to do their job the best they can. And active caring is a core part of our social pillar. But if you think about it, our environmental pillar is really thinking about it's an extension of that active caring, and it's taking it, beyond our site fences, sort of to that global reach.
Can we maybe dive in a little bit more to those pillars? You put out the ESG report. There's, I believe, 3 pillars and 7 impact areas. Can you take us through that? And I think that'll help explain a little bit more what you all are focused on.
Sure. So if we talk about, we talked about environmental, social, and governance, but we frame them as sustain our planet, protect and actively care for people, and purposefully transform our industry. And then those 3 pillars divide into 7 areas of impact. And those have very simple, like our statements, thinking about who or what we're focusing on impacting. Because that is really what's important, right? Is the impact at the end. And so in our sustain our planet pillar, it's our projects and our operations. So that's really thinking about the buildings we build, right? It's the energy efficiency of the buildings. It's the materials that go into them. Where are those materials coming from? What's the embodied carbon of those materials? And then it's also thinking about the work that we do. That's our operations, right? When we're building a building, what are our impacts on, again, energy, water, waste, ecosystems? And those are the things that we can directly control. So we kind of break them into those 2 categories. So our social pillar is protect and actively care for people, right? So that's our employees, thinking about the benefits that our employees need, the training. How can we support our employees in the best way possible? All the things that they need to be able to do their jobs and develop their careers and grow to the potential that they can. The next impact area is our business partners. So that's thinking about our trade partners. And that goes into things like safety, worker well-being, and mental health, which are so, so important, as well as looking further into our supply chain, really thinking about, where materials are coming from and the impact in that global supply chain. And then we go to our communities. So we can impact our communities in so many ways. And I think it's really important to us that when we go into a community that we don't build a building and leave, right? That we're really building these relationships. We want to build and support the local economy. So, there are traditional engagements with volunteering and with donations and sponsorships, but it's also really looking at workforce development. It's UBE development and engagement. We have the Turner School of Construction Management that's been around for many, many, many years. That's, a core part of building these businesses that can grow and continue to develop those local economies. And then as we go into our governance pillar, right, that's purposefully transform our industry. So we talked a little bit about, sort of traditional governance, thinking about ethics and compliance and human rights and processes and standardization and accountability. But this is also where innovation comes in. Because when we think about how we'll purposefully impact our industry and the world as a whole, right? Innovation is going to be a core component of that. So the 2 our statements there are our business and our world.
It's really interesting because you talked about your trade partners. And I think one of the things that, Chris, we heard I was actually our first episode, we had Josh Bone from Electri, and he quantified the amount of cost that trade partners are eating annually. And I just want to make sure I check my notes, $48 billion annually is what they have assessed. And I know there's this traditional relationship between general contractor and specialty contractor, but we're starting to see I'll call a downward trend in the contracts between the trade partner and the GC, shifting more and more of that risk over to the trade partner. And when we're having conversations around the productivity gap and really looking at this as a root cause analysis, this inevitably always comes back around to, well, how are we interacting with our supply chain and how are we interacting with our trade partners? Are we thinking about them contractually? Does our contract reflect that, what we say and we care? Now, Turner's a large organization and you're obviously leading the way here, but I really want to know, how does that translate then into the actual contracts that you have with your trade partners?
I think it's really about sort of that alignment of process and values, right? And so as we engage with our trade partners, we're really trying to, align on those values of active caring. We talk about our house being our home, right? That when people come onto our job sites, that we want them to feel like they can be themselves, and that they can, feel safe and welcomed. Just those kinds of activities are a really important step in, maintaining those positive relationships with our trade partners because they're so important to the work that we do.
And I think that it can be a subtle component, but what I'm kind of taking away as you're talking through each of these parts of the ESG program and the pillars is this is really just a way of codifying how you operate as a business and the values that are driving how you operate as a business. And so I want to look at the construction industry in general just a little bit and how we've been focused for a lot on safety and community engagement. And I think safety is a great example of what it looks like when the industry does come together and we do link arms and we do have a common approach to protecting the people who do the work that we're doing. But when we think about environmental issues, this is really different when you look at this across the country. If we look at California, for instance, this is going to be very sharp and focused, especially with the California Senate Bill 253. So there are other things that are really driving the prioritization from an environmental standpoint. But Turner's a global company, but you have a real nationwide footprint. How is Turner navigating the shift on that environmental side, specifically around your scopes 1, 2, and 3 that you were mentioning around emissions? And what does that path forward look like? Because I feel like right now everyone just kind of sit and wait. But what does that path forward look like for you all?
Yeah, well, let's take a definition break. Let's talk about what scope 1, 2, and 3 are. So scope 1 emissions are what are called direct emissions. So those are from fossil fuels that we own or operate. So it's things like generators or fleet vehicles or natural gas in our offices. And then if we move to scope 2, that is the electricity from assets that we own or operate as well, right? So same kinds of ideas, thinking about the electricity in our job sites, the electricity in our offices, the electricity for charging of electric vehicles, all of those things. And then when we move into scope 3, I kind of call that the other bucket, because it includes so many different things. It's upstream and downstream emissions. It's thinking about embodied carbon in the materials in the buildings that we build. It's the operational energy of the buildings that we build. It's also things like transportation emissions, thinking about commuting and business travel and a number of things like that. So scope 3 is a very, very big category where we don't necessarily have direct control, whereas in our scope 1 and scope 2, those are things that we do directly control as an organization. So, as you look at forthcoming disclosure requirements around those kinds of emissions, one of the first things to do is just start to understand what those numbers are. And Greenhouse Gas Protocol is very good at explaining, options of how to do that, of whether you have direct data or whether you're using, a calculations-based methodology. But that's kind of the first place to start, right? Is just to kind of understand what your baseline is and what elements of your operations go into those different categories. And so we've been doing this for a number of years, which really lays the groundwork for the disclosure requirements that will come from, different municipalities or just client requests that we get. We already do get requests from specific clients to provide emissions related disclosures.
And I think that's important being a global company and maybe a little more top of mind for you as a global company where we're seeing more progress in this area or more of an acute focus on this in the European market than we are in the US. Do you think that informs a little bit about how Turner's able to then strategize this and bring that into the US as well?
Yeah, the European legislation is very much informing the directions that we're seeing companies go because especially when we look at our global clients, they're being strongly influenced or, even they're subject to those legislation pieces as well. And so as they look at their own supply chains, right? So we're a part of their supply chain. And that's kind of, the interesting part of this is there's a web of supply chains that start to happen, right? My scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1 and 2. And then there's overlap of scope 3 too, right? It will fall into ours as well as other people's. And so you develop these like interdependencies and that's where you start to see, the markets shift. And that's why we're getting, requests for information and we'll continue to see these changes coming from our global clients because, we're a key component of their global supply chain.
I think one of the things that's been super helpful for me as part of these conversations is it's been really helpful to help frame that a lot of these things are things that we already focus on, but maybe haven't put in place the formal programs, the governance. But now that you have it, Turner, you've issued this first report, what are you charting for next year? What are you most optimistic about? And how do you think about its future impacts?
So 2024 was really focused on data. We really, it's important to have a strong baseline understanding of where we are to be able to see improvements. We're beginning to work on reduction strategies in a number of different places. But for 2024, we really needed to sort of lay that foundation and understand what our baseline was. In lean construction, they talk a lot about the idea of standardizing. And so that's basically what we're trying to do. So 2025 is going to be very focused on those improvements and reduction strategies. What are the specific areas that we need to focus on to, drive down emissions, reduce our water usage, to improve safety rates, to improve our impact in our communities around volunteering or UVE engagement? And so, we'll be really looking for what the numbers are that result in 2025 and ahead, right? It's not like we'll be done in 2025. We've got lots of work to do, but that's very much the focus going forward.
Awesome. Well, we are now at the part of the podcast where we ask you 5 rapid fire questions. Some of our guests are really good at giving one-sentence answers. Others, not so much. But we ask you to keep them short. So the first one is, what book are you reading or have you read that you would recommend to others?
So I think picking a favorite book is like picking a favorite child. But I'm currently reading Co-Intelligence, Living and Working with AI by Ethan Mollick, who spoke at our Turner Innovation Summit last week. And it's a really good book. So
awesome. I think I might have to put that one on my list.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's going on Chris's list.
Yeah, that's on my list. Okay, so if you're looking to source some different perspective, where are you going to find that?
So definitely the colleagues that I work with, when we're looking at each of their different subject matter expertise, I really appreciate being able to give somebody a call and talk through something. But my other source, a little more non-traditional, is actually ChatGPT. That's where I can ask all my silly questions.
Silly questions. I love
that.
asking
That's the
silly
first I've
questions.
heard for ChatGPT.
I know.
That's good.
If you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think it's to rely more on resources and ask for help, that I don't have to do everything myself.
I think we could all take that advice.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Myself included. What's one trend or innovation that you think is going to shape the future of construction?
Artificial intelligence.
Straight to the point. All right, last one. If construction had a tagline as an industry, what would it be?
So I'm going to build on Turner's. It's building the future sustainably.
Excellent.
Very fitting.
I was going to say that is so on brand for this conversation and for today. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this with us. I think there's a need for more dialogue and just frank conversations around ESG in general. So the definitions and explaining the acronyms is very helpful for the audience. So thank you so much for joining us today and for speaking at the conference. We're really, really glad to have you as part of those industry leaders who are driving and changing and pushing the industry forward.
Thanks so much for having me.
And for those of you who are watching, if anything that was shared here today resonates with you, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll keep bringing you the stories of leaders who are reshaping our industry, harnessing the power of construction.